I wanted to make a video today about the 1976 Mr. Olympia contest. Now you might be asking yourselves, what is the significance of the 1976 Mr. Olympia? Well, in the early 1970s, Arnold Schwarzenegger dominated the Olympia scene and was the most dominant Mr. Olympia in Olympia history at that point in time, winning his first 6 Olympia titles from 1970 to 1975, ending with the 1975 Mr. Olympia. Obviously, the filming of Pumping Iron took place, documenting the journey of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Lou Ferrigno, and of course Serge Nubret to that 1975 Olympia stage. And of course, as we all know, in 1975, a lot of people thought that marked the end of an era because Arnold officially announced his retirement during the 1975 Mr. Olympia after he won that title. Now, as we all know, he would come back in 1980, but the following year in 1976 would be the first Mr. Olympia without Arnold Schwarzenegger, and that made things very, very interesting. Now, before we dive into the 1976 Mr. Olympia, I want to rewind a little bit to the 1974 Mr. Olympia. Now, the reason I want to do that is because in 1974, that was the first Mr. Olympia competition ever to have 2 different weight classes, the over 200 and, of course, the under 200. Now, that fact is important because in 1976, you'd have the first winner of a Mr. Olympia that won the under 200 and then went on to win the overall Olympia title by defeating a heavyweight or a over 200-pound bodybuilder. So in 1976, not only was Arnold no longer in the over 200 division, but Lou Ferrigno and Serge Nubret, who had previously been dominant members of the over 200, both of them were not in it as well. So all of the competitors in the over 200 division were brand new competitors to the Mr. Olympia, and Ken Waller, who won, and Mike Katz, who took second. Now, you may remember both of those names from Pumping Iron. Now, their journey was documented, but it was not their journey to the Mr. Olympia. It was their journey to a amateur show. In 1976 would be both of their first Olympias. Then in the under 200-pound category, you had Franco Columbo, Frank Zane, Ed Corney, Bill Grant, and Boyer Coe. Bill Grant and Boyer Coe also competing in their first Mr. Olympia ever. So 1976 marked the end of an era. It marked the end of the era of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it marked the beginning of an era of new bodybuilding champions. Particularly, it marked the beginning of the under 200 bodybuilder era. So from 1976 to 1979, the winner of the Mr. Olympia competition would be all under 200-pound bodybuilders. So in 1976, of course, you had Franco Columbo winning his first of 2 Mr. Olympias. So that was significant that Franco won his first title. But the following year, 1977, 1978, and 1979, you had Frank Zane win his 3 Mr. Olympia titles. Frank Zane also an under 200-pound bodybuilder. So the interesting thing here is that Arnold Schwarzenegger would come back in 1980 to compete in the 1980 Mr. Olympia. And at the 1980 Mr. Olympia, there were no weight classes. There was no over 200, there was no under 200. So the end of Arnold Schwarzenegger's bodybuilding career marked the beginning of the under 200 champion, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger coming back in 1980 marked the end of the under 200 champion. So I don't know what significance there is to that, and if Arnold had anything to do with that, but that just happens to be the case. So that is the story of the significance of the 1976 Mr. Olympia. I've got a couple other very popular videos about some of the older Mr. Olympias as well, and I'm planning on doing some more in the future, so stay tuned for those.